Good morning, everybody, and it's a pleasure for me to welcome you all to the Irish Grassland Association Dairy Summer Tour for 2021. Due to COVID restrictions again this year, we were unfortunately not able to bring you an event where you're able to visit farms, but unusually it gives us an opportunity this year to bring two stories from two farmers in different parts of the country. We're coming live to you this morning from two locations. I'm here on the farm of Kevin Moran in County Galway, and we'll be going later in the morning to the farm of John Joe O'Sullivan, who is in Rosscarbery in County Cork. If you remember our dairy conference earlier in the year, one of the papers focused on the topic of nitrogen and nitrogen efficiency. And one of the topics that was mentioned was the importance of clover in the future in our systems. So today's Dairy Summer Tour focuses on clover. The farm of Kevin Moran will focus on a case where we're looking at a farmer looking at beginning a journey of incorporating clover onto the farm, and then in County Cork, John Joe O'Sullivan will give us his reflections on having clover incorporated into the system for a number of years. I want to thank Stuart Childs and all the organising committee who have pulled today's event together. And finally, I want to thank our sponsors, AIB, who have come on board again this year to support our Dairy Summer Tour. And I hand you now to Eamon O'Reilly of AIB, who will say a few words on their behalf.
Thank you very much, Stan. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Eamon O'Reilly. I'm the Agri-Advisor with AIB covering Galway, Longford and Westmeath. We in AIB are once again delighted to partner with Irish Grassland Association to bring you the Dairy Summer Tour. It feels a bit strange here to be standing here on the farm of Kevin Moran for the Irish Grassland Association Dairy Summer Tour, and with a very small crowd here in attendance of committee and some of the stakeholders. Unfortunately, that's the situation we find ourselves in, and hopefully it won't be too long before we're back out on farm this time next year. Nevertheless, whether you're watching the event from home, you're very, very welcome, and we hope that you benefit from the experiences and the practical insights from these two progressive and forward-thinking host farmers. We're all too aware that our grass-based production is one of the greatest competitive advantages globally, both from a cost perspective and confirming our position as one of the lowest carbon footprint food producers in the world. But we're also well aware that global demand for protein and our high-quality produce will remain strong. Changes in on-farm practices are inevitable, and in confirming our position as one of the lowest carbon footprint food producers in the world. But we're also aware that the global demand for protein and our high-quality produce will remain strong. Change of on-farm practices is inevitable, and in some cases even required, if we are to meet our national obligations and transition to a net zero emissions by 2050. There are many out there who are only too happy to position and portray the Irish dairy sector in a very negative light with broader climate change discourse, with little regard to our strong global credentials, or indeed the fact that there is no other group in society as committed to truly be a fundamental part of the climate change solution as Irish farmers. With our grassland farms, hedgerows and forest plantations holding an innate carbon sequestration potential to offset much of the externalities of production, many farmers are already well underway in their sustainability journey and want to do their part. But they need help, support and guidance in making the transition without negatively impacting the viability of their existing farm operations. The management of clover in Irish grassland isn't a new technology, but it represents one such approach that has the potential to deliver both economically and environmental gains to Irish farmers. As a leading lender to the sector, in AIB we recognise the role that we must play in providing the most appropriate support to our customers as they enhance and develop their business in a sustainable way that works for them and for future generations. If planning future change on your individual farm, whether potentially a new or existing customer, I would encourage you to engage with your local AIB branch, your local business advisor, or with ourselves in the Agri-Advisor team, myself or any of our clients, or any of our Agri-Advisor team that's across the country, and we will support your farm requirements. Finally, I would like to thank Stan, Stuart, Maura and Irish Grassland Association team who've been working very hard to bring this event to you and to our host farmers on the day, Kevin, John Joe and Andrew, who are very much looking forward to getting your views and insights on this very important topic. Thank you very much, and I'll hand you back to Stan.
Thank you very much, Eamon, and thank you to all at AIB for your ongoing support of the Irish Grassland Association. We will go straight now into our first farmer this morning, Kevin Moran in County Galway. We're coming live from his farm here at the moment. We will be joined by Paul Hyland and Kevin in a moment, but first, to introduce Kevin and his farm here, we will play a short video to give you the background of his farm.
My name is Kevin Moran, originally from County Mayo. We're here today in County Galway. We have 91 hectares of a milking platform, 105 hectares whole farm. When I was 17, after finishing my Leaving Cert, set about trying to find my own path to farming. I'm the youngest of 11 children. My home farm was very fragmented, heavy, not really suited to dairy farming. Milked 40 cows as when I was growing up, and I suppose it was a case of having to make another basket rather than putting more eggs into the basket that was already quite full. When I was 19, I agreed a lease here with my uncle. It's my father's home farm, and I suppose we started farming in my own right in 2013 with 72 cows, and since then it's grown. More land has come on around me, and since 2013 I've grown it to 270 cows here today. I'm the only full-time person working on the farm here for 270 cows, which is quite efficient from that point of view. However, there is a good team in terms of relief staff there in the background. So in 2013 I purchased 75 cows, milked 72 cows that year, and then gradually over the next 4 years would have increased cow numbers up to 270 cows. I've been very fortunate in terms of the people who've taken it on themselves to help me, and the gratitude I have to them it's enormous. My uncles Joe and Michael, who I suppose leased me their farms on long-term leases and put that trust in me and who guaranteed me. I'm very lucky as well. I'm the youngest of 11. I'm probably as spoiled a young lad that you're going to get, but I know it, and my parents as well. So I suppose to have that support there going out day to day, you're almost fearless because you have that support network around you, and you tackle things with that bit more courage. And I suppose I'm very fortunate like that in terms of the network of people around me who've believed in me and helped me along the way.
Thank you, Stan, and indeed I'd like to thank AIB and Eamon again for their continued support. I'm delighted to be joined here by Kevin Moran, and Kevin, thanks for having us. It's not an easy thing, and particularly under these circumstances where it's all digital, and it'd be nice to have a crowd in front of you, and we have a beautiful, beautiful day here. But just before we begin with Kevin, just a little bit of housekeeping. There will a mobile number appear on your screens throughout the presentation. Feel free at any time to text in a question. We will endeavour to get the question to our hosts. Kevin, maybe you'd start off by telling us what part of the country we're in. We're in Galway. Where are we at the minute? Just for people outside of Galway to know where we are.
Okay, Paul. Well, firstly, you're very welcome, and everyone watching is very welcome. So where are we today? We are about 2 miles from the Mayo-Galway border, near Shrule in County Mayo, about 2 miles from Headford in County Galway. So that's the geography.
Very good. And you're not originally from this farm. This isn't your home farm, is it, Kevin?
No, so I'm originally a Mayo man from Claremorris. So this is started out as my father's home farm. My uncle was farming it. My Uncle Joe was farming it here in Carlistran.
Well, we probably won't go into why you came back from Mayo to Galway, but we can surmise, and we might leave that open. Maybe a text might come in and let us know why you moved. Kevin, you're a young man. You've achieved quite a bit. We have a slide. Perhaps we put it up on the screen here now. We leave it on long enough for people just to digest the progression over the years. But Kevin, we'll talk over it. Kevin, you were determined to get going. I have to think, listening to you and meeting you before, you were determined to get going. Maybe you'd briefly take us back to the genesis of this and the start of this, because we've a long way, a lot of ground to cover now. Okay,
so to be brief, Paul, I suppose day one, and even as young as 12, 13, growing up on the farm and learning the basics of spotting sick animals and animal behaviour and stuff was invaluable. But I had what very few had in secondary school, which is clarity of what it was I wanted to go on and do. And so in 2013, I set about, I suppose I had a good relationship with my Uncle Joe and set about getting a long-term lease on his farm. The video explained, I suppose, why maybe the home farm wasn't suited to dairying. Getting finance, Paul, was very difficult day one. I suppose I was 19. I was going in looking for a lot of money and no experience, no track record, no credibility, and didn't understand the financial system, things like loan-to-value ratio and all the rest of it.
Well, maybe you just give us a little bit of background on that. The lessons you learned along the way, because you had a few refusals, but as you say, there were more lessons than refusals, if you understand. So maybe you just take us through the mistakes you made, what you would do differently again. Now, I know experience gives you that, but it'd be no harm to share with some of our...
Yeah, so I suppose day one, Paul, in probably over the course of 2 or 3 months, I got 9 refusals. So I suppose that sounds like a lot, but essentially I was going to 4 different banks, so it was 2 applications that probably got turned down, but 9 refusals probably sounds a bit better. But so look, I suppose the big thing for me was I didn't understand things like loan-to-value ratio, repayment capacity, all of these things, and those 2 or 3 months were actually invaluable to my overall farming career in terms of what I learned. What was different about the 10th proposal was, and it's coincidental that Eamon O'Reilly is here today because he was probably the biggest player in it, and my Teagasc advisor Mike, I suppose we sat around the table and we said, look, they figured I wasn't going away, and says, right, well, what's the application missing? And it was collateral, it was security, and that's where my Uncle Joe stepped in. And we probably borrowed less because the lack of a track record and credibility element. And we'll allude to it maybe later on, but over the past 5-6 years, that has been a big part, in terms of allowing me to go and do a rotary parlour and a cubicle per cow and an underpass and develop the farm.
We might come through the progression to where we are today.
Okay.
But what you're saying is that support network was very important. You didn't just arrive here and start milking cows. There was more to it than that.
Correct. And also what was important, Paul, and to any young person thinking, I suppose, starting out, I guess Eamon and the bank could see that my uncles were behind me, my family were behind me, my relationship with my VIT and my co-op. I remember a member of the co-op was involved as well with Arrivo, which was brilliant. And they could see that, and I suppose that gave them great confidence in me as well.
So you got stock on the ground. Just take us through that as... I'm getting a time signal here. We're
okay.
Eating through time. If you could just bring us up through the stock and where you started.
So day one, I suppose, look, I had to try and make do with what I couldn't go out and borrow the full amount, I remember my uncle there a couple of weeks ago, he says, would you not have saved a fortune if you went in day one with the big bang, as he says, and put in the what's here today? And in hindsight, yes, we would have saved a good bit of capital and a lot of time and a lot of work. But I think the big thing was I didn't have the credibility and a track record.
It's the old chestnut, isn't it? I mean, it's the right thing to do, but it was the wrong thing to do because you had no cash flow either. You had no
Correct.
way of getting it. So
but we invested in cows and grass.
You crept before you walked.
Exactly.
Now, you've invested heavily in infrastructure. Like I see a lovely rotary parlour here. But you had a reason behind that. You were very labour intensive and it kind of scattered for a few years while you were trying to build stock numbers. Maybe you take us through a bit of that.
Okay, so day one, I suppose, Paul, I had to prioritise investment on cows and grass and grazing infrastructure and work with below adequate facilities, I suppose, in terms of milking. And one thing I learned, you need either, and it was something Mike said to me before, you need either good facilities or good people. And in those few years, I was very lucky to have good people. My brother Stephen, Evan Hunt down in Tubbercurry, fantastic guys who really put their shoulder to the wheel and helped me along the way, you know. So that's what got us through those few years. And it also, because the labour was very good, I suppose our KPIs were quite good, and that again was giving us credibility and track record. And so I suppose then fast forward 5-6 years, we had the credibility, we had the track record, and I went and invested in a rotary. The two lads were moving on, and invested in a rotary, I suppose, to make it a simple system and add the simplicity. The overall system in terms of the cow type, the grazing, the spring calving, that was all there. But the last cog in terms of simplicity was facilities, and thankfully in 2019 we added that on with a cubicle per cow.
Yeah, well, it's a pity that we couldn't be live here today and take you for a walk around this farm and see the lack of investment outside of the yard. There's huge investment in paddocks, but there's no big shiny John Deeres driving around the place, or, well, not to be brand specific, machinery driving around the place. You were very specific on what you invested in. You weren't afraid to borrow, obviously, but you were very careful about what you invested in.
Yeah, and again, that's why I think those 9 refusals at the start, Paul, were a blessing in disguise, because that really drilled it into me that you have to make capital count, and the most expensive capital is what's spent twice.
Would you have any messages for young people starting again, or middle-aged people like myself? I still call myself middle-aged, starting again. You know, if they were going on the same journey, what lessons did you learn, mistakes not to do a second time?
Yeah, so I guess to me, when I look back in hindsight, Paul, the single biggest thing that stood to me was the relationships I had with people. And it's very hard because it's not tangible to put a value on that. And they're essentially what got me here, So with my uncles, with the Rileys, with my bank, with my co-op, with my VIT, they are really, if you're on the same page and the same wavelength as them and you enjoy the relationship, that's a big point. That you
mentioned something to me in earlier meetings, that even your calves are, you have an operator who will take your calves from you. They're taken early in the day and looked after. Like it's literally only calving and milking here.
Yeah, so John, Joe and Katie, they alternate between them. So the case, they get the colostrum and they go down to a yard about 600 yards down the road, and their only job is to rear calves. The calves then, of course, once weaned, go to my brother to be contract reared, and they come back on the point to calf. And that, along with the fact there's no machinery and the contractors do the machinery work, simplifies my system. And
a real team effort. And hopefully we'll get into a bit more further along during the day. Kevin, for the moment, thank you very much. I'm just going to go to Stan. Might have a few questions coming in. I'm not sure if there's a question there, Stan.
So thanks. Yes, we have a few questions coming in. I think one interesting one, Kevin, that has come in, I think you've talked about the process of how you overcame some of the knockbacks, but in terms of what you did about it, but the resilience, and maybe particularly for young people watching, how did you keep going considering you got 9 refusals, and what really gave you the grit and the determination to keep trying and keep knocking on the doors until it happened?
Yeah, and again, I don't mean to come across cheesy or anything. The big thing for me, there was dark days there, Stan, days where you got refused and you couldn't see a way forward, but I was very fortunate that I could always pick up the phone, or there would be to my sister Margarita, or whoever that could basically take a neutral, objective point of view to it, Stan, and refocus you. So I'm very fortunate. I can't emphasise it enough, the people that kind of helped me along the way.
Okay, thanks very much, Stan. My name is Vincent Griffith. I'm on the Grassland Council, and I suppose more importantly of all, a fellow Mayo man and a fellow Clonmorris man. So I know Kevin very well all across the years. I suppose what we're going to do over the next few minutes now, we're just going to have a run through, give everyone a flavour of what's happening on the farm at the moment and current farm performance. So I think there's a slide there that we're going to just put up in front of us there. So Kevin, I suppose we'll just start there. Current performance at the moment, Kevin, in terms of production.
So current performance, Vinny, is we're doing 22 litres, 451 fat and 370 protein. So 1.86 kilos of solids on 0.8 kg of ration. And once they come below the 22 litres, I'll pull out the ration altogether.
Yeah, perfect, Kevin. And over the year, what would you be feeding over the year in terms of total kgs a meal?
So we push hard to try to get 500 kilos. So essentially the goal is a kilo for a kilo for a kilo. A kilo of solids to a kilo live weight to a kilo of ration. Now, the thing is, we're not afraid to go over it if we have to feed the cow. You need a very good year to achieve that, okay? So that's kind of the goal. We're feeding 610 kilos last year of ration.
I suppose moving on, a grass-based system, fertility performance, very important in that to maximise grass utilisation. Again, what sort of KPIs are you hitting there, Kevin?
So in 2020, we calved 89% in 6 weeks. In 2021, we calved 92% in 6 weeks, with 8% empty after 11 weeks.
Okay, perfect. So excellent results. Like, you have invested in milking facilities. Have you invested in heat detection aids, or how are you working that?
So our heat detection, Vinny, is quite simple. I suppose it's just tail paint. We put a big emphasis on tail paint, and I get Katie to milk there every Tuesday evening, so I'll top up tail paint, or she will. And yeah, so keep the tail paint topped up, and we have a mirror in the rotary and we can see the cows. So we have an automatic drafter, which is a big part of taking the work out of drafting cows. And we AI once a day.
Perfect, Kevin. I suppose the other story then, massive expansion here over the last 7 or 8 years. Your story on her genetics, I suppose, where you came from, and I suppose more importantly for maybe our viewers, where are you going to go in terms of crossbreeding and use of EBI?
Okay, so I guess day one, as I alluded to earlier with Paul, Vinny, is that I suppose I didn't know what I didn't know at the start, and in hindsight I can see that now, and probably still the case. But the cows I bought, I didn't have an understanding of EBI, similar to why we'll touch on it with Clover, but I didn't have an understanding of EBI, and so the cows I bought, the 75 cows I bought in 2013, had an EBI of under €10. And I suppose then land started coming on, I learned a lot, I realised, okay, I've made a mistake here, I need to follow EBI and increase EBI. And so by expanding the herd and buying high EBI crossbred genetics, it allowed me to actually increase the herd EBI at a far faster rate than what it would if I wasn't expanding, which is unusual to a degree, I suppose. Going forward, I'm focused on crossbreeding with sex semen and high EBI. I suppose I see it that one, you know, sometimes you can see a bit of polarisation in the debate, but I think one complements the other really well.
Okay, perfect. And I suppose we'll move on then maybe to give people a flavour of the overall system at the moment, and I think we've a second slide there to show everyone. Kevin, in terms of overall farm stocking rates, what are you running the farm at in terms of whole farm and milk and block stocking rate?
Okay, so again, simple system, and stocking rate is probably one of the biggest things that in terms of achieving that day to day. So my whole farm stocking rate, Vinny, is 2.57, which is sustainable at a growth rate of 15.8. Hopefully we'll break 16 tonne this year, with about 220, just shy of it, kgs of chemical nitrogen per hectare. A milk and platform stocking rate of 2.9, which I think is really important to keep things simple on the shoulders. And I have a very basic rule of thumb. I'll stock the milk and platform to 80% of my total annual feed has to come off the milking platform. And whatever I'm growing, I'll stock my stocking rate accordingly to that.
Yeah, so no temptation with excellent facilities to ramp up the stocking rate to 3.5 and bring in a bit extra feed. You don't see profit in that, Kevin?
No, because I think once you go beyond that point of 80%, you're just moving money around the table, Vinny, and surplus cash is what makes repayments, and surplus cash is what's enjoyable profit, not necessarily turnover, you know.
Okay, and I suppose growing nearly 16 tonnes of grass in the west of Ireland, soil fertility, Kevin, your story there, and particularly as we move on to the Clover journey, very important. How are you working out there?
So I'm lucky and fortunate in that, I suppose, day one when I got in, I had a big thirst for knowledge, and soil fertility and grassland was a big part of it, as well as herd genetics. We started with a low base. Majority was index 1 and 2, but I suppose I put my money where my mouth is, and you know, fortunately, over the past 5 years, there's been a big soil fertility building program in place, and now it's about holding it, I guess. So we're at, give or take, 90% optimum. I have a small segment of the farm that's a peat-based soil, and I'm finding it very difficult to lift them from index 1. And so it's kind of a different approach to that part, that minority of the farm, and that little and often in terms of P&K.
Okay, perfect, Kevin. I suppose we're going to move on now to the meat for the Clover stuff, and we've a short video here, I suppose, explaining Kevin's decision to move to Clover, and we'll take the discussion on a bit then after the video.
So I'm at the start of my Clover journey, which started in spring of last year. I get asked the question, why? So why Clover? And for me, there's probably a broader thing there in terms of my farm. I want to farm in a respectful and sustainable manner. And for me, I've always had a business plan with financial goals, and I've done a sustainability plan, an environmental plan, if you like, with environmental goals to complement that. And a big part of that is Clover. Clover is probably, for me, looking at things and the things I could do here to reduce my carbon footprint, reduce my impact on water quality and air quality, and increase my biodiversity. There's low-hanging fruits in all of those 4 pillars, if you like, and one of them was Clover. And so for me, Clover gives an environmental return, but it also gives an economic return. And so that for me is why I'm pursuing getting Clover into all the sports here. The less fertiliser that comes in that gate, the lower my carbon footprint is per litre of milk, the less nitrogen that I'm going to be leaching, and also, I suppose, from an economic point of view, the less fertiliser, nitrogen that comes in that gate, the better it is for my current account. Clover, for me, the pros far outweigh any cons. The research has shown that you can achieve the same tonnage with reduced fertiliser, and for me, that's a really positive move. There was a massive missed opportunity, and I have to take complete responsibility for that, in that as I started farming, the whole farm has practically been reseeded since 2013, and I wasn't incorporating clover into reseeds. And that is something that I have to take responsibility for and say that I got wrong. It was a lack of knowledge on my behalf, I suppose. That said, it's never too late to do the right thing.
Okay, everyone is welcome back onto the farm here in Galway. I suppose the video has just given us a flavour of the start of your journey, Kevin. Like, I know the farm quite well here. Kevin, down through the years, obviously been involved with the co-op. Excellent grassland manager always, but not a lot of clover here, and really only on that journey. You might just give us a bit more detail on why the sudden change of heart, I suppose.
Okay, so as I alluded to in the video, Vinny, there was a real missed opportunity there in terms of, and I'll touch on it with Mike, but in terms of establishing clover, because there was so much reseeding going on. And ultimately it's the same answer as why didn't I buy high EBI cows day one? And that's simply because my own knowledge wasn't good enough at the time, and I didn't fully understand clover, and so I was a little bit afraid of it, if you like. So why the change? The change, I suppose, in that, environmentally, we all know, and everyone watching has felt the wrath over the last maybe particularly couple of years in terms of global climate change and I suppose our own domestic targets in terms of reducing our emissions. And it needs to be, everyone has to do their bit. So I suppose to answer your question, why the sudden change? Environmentally, it's one of the real low-hanging fruits and one of the first things we need to get right.
And I suppose, look, you've spoken as well, and you've spoken to Paul earlier about the simple system, the one labour unit here on the farm, and then obviously with relief help. Are you at all concerned that maybe clover might complicate that system, or what are your thoughts on that?
It's funny actually, because that was one of the things that caused me to be sceptical about clover day one, and now that I'm doing it, I realise, well, actually, there's nothing. It's not actually adding complication. I think there's a difference between adding complication and adding strategy. Ultimately, a field that has clover, a field that doesn't, it's the same management they get, January to May. And then after that, I think, oversowing it and getting it incorporated, there's a little bit of strategy there, a small bit of labour, but it's kind of at a good pocket in between calving and breeding. And, I think, obviously, it's more decision-based difference rather than workload-based from there on in. You graze paddocks, at a lower cover and so forth.
And if we spoke about the drive to putting clover on this farm, you've spoken environmentally, work from Clonakilty and Moore Park would show a benefit in terms of extra cow performance, in terms of increased milk solids. Do you expect to get that, or is that something you've built into your business plans?
To be honest, Vinny, the research is saying I'll get it. A lot of my clover will come from being oversown, so I might not get the same clover content as a full reseed or greenfield site. I'm banking on my business plan on I suppose, retaining the same amount of tonnage grown, so 16 tonnes, with less nitrogen. I'm not banking on getting extra output because my herd is going to be maturing, my genetics are going to be improving, and that's how I'm, through maturity and genetic improvement is how I'm going to get extra output.
Okay. And Kevin, I suppose you've spoken about environmental plans and stuff like that. Outside of clover, what else are you going to do on that environmental side?
Yeah, so I guess I done an environmental plan, Vinny, similar, as I said, similar to a business plan, if you like, with a set of, I sat down and asked myself, what's the farm going to look like in 7 years' time? And so there's really 4 elements of that plan, if you like, or 4 key headings. And they're greenhouse gas emissions, water quality, air quality, and biodiversity. And so under each of those headings, I have a list of 7 or 8 different actions, what year I'm going to do them, and how much of each I'm going to do in each year. And that allows me then to be more structured in doing these actions. Things like planting hedgerows, planting trees, I'm already doing low emission slurry spreading, but covering slurry stores, managing dirty water, buffer zones along drains, things like that.
Yeah, I suppose you've told us what your current system is, current stocking rate, your output per cow and stuff like that. If we come back here in 10 years' time, maybe for an in-person IGA dairy summer tour, what would you hope your system would look like at that stage?
I hope my system would look as enjoyable as what it is now, and as labour friendly as what it is now. I hope you'd be looking at greenhouse gas emissions per litre of milk of certainly below 0.5, somewhere between 0 and 0.5. And again, a system that's retained its simplicity, that's enjoyable to work in, and that's environmentally friendly.
That's perfect, Kevin. I think you've given an excellent run through now. I'm going to hand over to Stan Lawler. Stan has got a couple of questions in from the audience, I think.
Thanks, Vinny.
Thanks, Vinny. Yeah, a couple of questions coming in again, Kevin. And one of the questions picks up on what you mentioned about the 80%, your feed strategy in terms of 80% on farm. Maybe develop that a little bit. Has that worked for you? Has there been a moment where that maybe has been tested, or what's your contingency plans around that, maybe for a difficult year or so on?
Yeah, so of course, what's an average year? There is no average year, I suppose, Stan. But ultimately, I think historically, you'll get one bad season, but it'll compensate for itself in another season. So if I look at my historical tonnage grown since I've improved my soil fertility, it's consistently been 15.6, 15.8. And I think the wheels don't come off the wagon when you put the horse before the cart, in that you grow that tonnage, okay, if it means a silage reserve, and then you apply the stocking rate. And I think that because on the shoulders, it's a stressful time on farm. And if you have to be putting in bucket loads of feed, buffer feeding, well into the year, I think it adds a lot of stress and a complication, and it doesn't add profit, in my opinion.
Okay. Another question coming in, I think, picking up on what you mentioned about your biodiversity plan for the farm and the actions around that. And I think you mentioned a list of 8 actions that you have, and you have it scheduled and time-framed. Where do you see the costs of that coming in, or do you see it as a cost at all? Or what's your motivation to guide you towards action on doing something there?
I think if I'm to be completely honest for a minute, Stan, I guess as a young guy starting out, I loved dairy farming. I loved farming, and I feel maybe there's been a little bit of that stolen from me in the past 2 years, in that we're overly vilified, if you like. And a big element of it is that I want to do good, and I want to ensure that my farm is not doing any harm on the environment. So I think there's an ethic liability, expectation on farmers, an ethic onus on farmers to do their bit in terms of biodiversity.
So the costs are part of the system as opposed to being something which you're...
Well, that's the thing about dairying, I think, Stan. It is probably the most profitable sector in farming, and so, whether we like it or not, we have to admit that maybe there is skin in the game there for us to reinvest in the environment, because ultimately, if we don't, maybe the cost might be far higher,
Okay. That's all for now, Vinny. Thanks.
Thanks a million, Stan. I suppose we're going to move on now to our final section, and that's with Mike Donoghue, the local Teagasc advisor here. I know Kevin and Mike have a great relationship, and Mike's been a huge part of the story here. So we've a short video there going to play on how Kevin, I suppose, has started that oversowing journey.
It's been a journey, it's been an education. I found that Clover is relatively unforgiving in terms of trying to get establishment. So the first step is the foundation. What's your pH? I found it needs to be more than 6.4. What's your P and K indexes? They need to be index 3. Then I found that oversowing in April and May, you get a far better take versus later in the season. I oversow it with the 9-bock, so I'll graze it to at least 4 centimetres. You need a tight grazing, and then I'll go in with the 9-bock and oversow it at 2 kgs per acre. After oversowing it, I will go with some watery slurry also. This year I also used a bag to the acre of Grand Lime after I oversowed it, and I found that I got good results from that. Depending on, I suppose, weather and drought and all the rest of it, I will do at least 2 bouts of clover, and ideally 3. And the reason for that is, you'll do your April allocation. It'll allow you to graze that 3, 4, 5 times at 1100, and then that's in a really good place then, and it's germinated and it's able to handle its own, and then you can start again and do the next bout where you can give priority to grazing the next section or the next 2 or 3 paddocks at 1100, and so on and so forth.
Hi, Kevin, can you take me through very briefly how you decide which paddock you're actually going to reseed in terms of clover? And in terms of putting in clover?
Okay, so I guess, look, it's quite simple really, Mike. There's a number of different headings, if you like, that it has to tick. So it has to be, if it's a paddock that I know I'm going to reseed within the next 3 or 4 years, I won't oversow it. It has to have a pH of higher than 6.4, and it has to have a P and a K index of at least 3, and it has to also be free of weeds. So if it has weeds and it's not going to be reseeded, I'll say, okay, I'll solve the weeds first and I'll get to you then next year.
Spot on. In terms of, and I think you touched off it, at the moment you're doing a lot of stitching in, would you have a preference for someone at home if they were putting in clover to stitch or full reseed?
Purely in terms of clover content and achieving a high clover content of 25% or more, Mike, I would definitely prefer reseeding. It's far easier to achieve a high clover content versus oversowing, because in oversowing, obviously, the young clover seedlings have to compete with a progressive and an aggressive perennial ryegrass that's in 5th gear and fully established.
Spot on. In terms of if you were doing a full reseed, would you have a preference for tetraploids or diploids, or where would you be on that conversation?
I think in my experience, limited experience of it, I'm finding tetraploids easier to get clover content, a high clover content, simply because, I suppose, 2 reasons, Mike. It tends to be a more open sward, so again, you get more sunlight down, to the surface, and also cows typically graze out tetraploids tighter and allowing sunlight down to where you're trying to get clover germination.
Spot on. In terms of docks, how do you handle docks in terms of clover?
So, it's quite simple, I suppose. The dock, if there is a dock problem, it has to be solved before you go in with clover. Simple as that. So, because I'm only starting out, I have a huge selection of paddocks to do. If there is a dock burden, I'll solve it this year, and I'll get clover in next year.
Spot on. Spraying and clover, if you're stitching in, would you spray after it? And by the same token, full reseed, would you spray after putting in the clover?
So take the full reseed. There's been issues with accessing clover safe sprays, but I do use clover safe sprays after reseed post emergence, and I think that is really important. In terms of oversowing, I think you have to have the problem of weeds put to bed before you oversow it, because typically in an oversown situation, your weeds have got a full grip and they're not seedlings, so they're quite difficult to kill.
Spot on. Thanks for that, Kevin. We're going to have a quick look at the post-sowing management now in this video.
The management after oversowing it is really, really important. As the clover germinates, my advisory has always told me you need sunlight getting at them. So I never let it go over 1100 of a pre-grazing yield for the first 5 or 6 grazings is very important. So the rest of the farm will be following with protected urea, whereas the paddocks that got clover will be getting 18612 or watery slurry. In terms of the establishment of clover, one mistake that I've made in the past is I tried to do too much at once. So last year, in my second phase, so we got a drought, so I done 2 paddocks in April, got a really good take with them, things got dry. After the drought, I went and done 6 paddocks altogether, and that was almost 20% of the farm. And I found that trying to keep all of those paddocks, which were coming at me at the same stage, grazed at 1100, to be really difficult. Whereas if you're more strategic and you do 2 paddocks at a time or 3 paddocks at a time, which is 7 or 11 or 12% of your farm at a time, it's a lot more manageable, because you can go to those paddocks and keep them grazed at 1100 and really allow them to tiller and allow sunlight down to the clover. Still very early days here in that I'm just little over 12 months doing it, but I found that certainly getting in April and May, oversowing then, the grazings afterwards, they certainly help. For me, the overall project is going to take 5 to 7 years. It's a 2-pronged approach. It's an oversowing approach, and it's also incorporating clover seed into all future reseeds. And for me, at the end of that 5 to 7 years, keeping your farm at 25% clover content is going to be an ongoing thing. No different to building soil indexes to index 3. For me, I personally, and it's only my own personal opinion, is that clover will be a part of that fertiliser index in your costs. It complements the grass-based system really well. It's a little bit more unforgiving, I would say, but at the end of the day, I think it's a big part of where we need to go, and it's completely worth it.
Brilliant. Kevin, can you take me through your first season fertiliser management with Clover? I know you touched off 18-6-12 and watery slurry in the video.
Okay, so I guess, Mike, to be honest, so year one, we've gone through how I identify a paddock. Once identified, then I use the iron box. So I'll do a tight grazing, or after a small cut of silage, I'll run with the iron box at 2 kgs of clover per acre. And then I'll follow it with 18-6-12 watery slurry. This year I left a gap and I went with a bag of Grand Lime. After that, Mike, I suppose there's a number of really important things: that it gets grazed at 1100, so you don't allow it to get shaded out by the grass, and also a consistent application of P and K throughout the next 4 rotations in terms of 18-6-12 or whatever. I don't cut nitrogen year one, Mike. You know, like, clover is almost like it's like putting someone through college that year one, if you understand me. You know, you're investing in it, you're not reaping any returns until it gets qualified in year two and it starts fixing nitrogen. So I don't bank on the clover to be, fixing nitrogen year one. It's all about developing it. And it does take 12 months to develop that clover to a mature position where it can start giving a return.
Spot on. So for year one, there's no difference with nitrogen. Take me through year two in terms of particularly the nitrogen part of the conversation with clover, year two.
Okay, so year two, Mike, again, with fully developed clover, the management of it from start of grazing early February right through to late April, early May is the same as the rest of the farm. Obviously, you try to avoid poaching your clover paddocks. But from then on, I'll go half rate nitrogen, because it's got 12 months, it's fully developed, and at that point then, you can see it starting to come to life. The content is lifting with each grazing, and at that point then I'm relying on it to fix nitrogen. And the first paddocks that I would have done last year, you can see it this year, I've gone on at half rate and it is working. There's an element of trust required, Mike, to trust it to do its job,
Spot on. You talk about half rate nitrogen, so about 9 units in application. Would that be a fair comment?
Yeah, so rule of thumb, midsummer, I go 1 unit per day. So if I'm on an 18-day rotation, I'll go 18 units. If I'm on a 21-day rotation, I'll go 21 units, and I'll half that for the clover paddocks.
Spot on. Talk to me very briefly about silage. Would you cut it during the first season after sowing? The second season, would you do silage any different with clover swords?
First season, no, simply because you keep grazing it at 1100, so the quality of the grass tends to be good anyhow. Dung pads don't generally become an issue. Year two, you're letting it grow on, and the rotation is that bit longer on it. And I'm finding that this year, that the paddocks I did last April, dung pads are starting to get high, and clover can potentially get shaded out in those areas. So I am giving it a run of a mower at least once. I've done them once, and you can see it's done it the world of good. So yeah.
Briefly. Brilliant. Briefly, can you take me through your autumn first season management and your spring first season management after sowing it in April or May? Okay,
so look, in autumn, I suppose, last year there's 2 paddocks in particular I did last year, and that there was one, I suppose, wet, one dry. I got the dry one grazed and it carried over a cover of about 700, Mike, over the winter. The wet one got too wet and I couldn't get it grazed, and it carried over a cover of 1500. And I found that definitely the paddock that carried a lower cover had far higher clover content this summer as opposed to the other one last year. It's almost just getting back to where it should be now, and I had to help nurse it, if you like, and help it back. So I suppose my clover paddocks, I'll typically aim to carry a lower cover on over the winter. That said, once I get to the position where the whole farm has clover, hopefully in 5 years' time, I'm not going to compromise carrying a farm cover over, because that's my system and I have a high demand in spring with a good 6-week rate. So what I'll be doing there is sort of an ongoing, if paddocks that carry a high cover over, I'll oversow them again in April to increase the clover content, or, if anything loses an index or gets poached, similar to that, I'll identify them and I'll say, okay, your clover content has decreased, so I'll try and increase it.
Brilliant. Last question we sometimes deal with in terms of clover, bloat. Where are you on bloat?
Yeah, and again, very similar to the conversation of spring cover and all that. I use that as an excuse not to do clover, and I'm finding the solution is quite simple. It's bloat oil or strip fences, I find, and the conversation of, not letting cows in hungry, and if they are, then you allocate them a specific amount is really important. So bloat for me is manageable with those 2 tools, bloat oil and strip fences.
Brilliant. Thanks a million for that, Kevin. I'm going to hand it over to Stan now, and he will finish up.
Okay, thanks, Michael. So the questions keep coming in, and I encourage everyone to keep the questions coming in at the text number, which is appearing at the bottom of the screen. A lot of people pick up on the oversowing, Kevin. Maybe talk us through the decision that oversowing is a big part of your strategy, maybe rather than just depending on it, incorporating clover on a receding cycle.
Okay, so I guess why? Simply because, Stan, it's unrealistic for me to try and, come in with a heavy receding program when I already have good perennial ryegrass varieties growing a lot of tonnage and I have a decent demand. So I suppose given the receding was already done, oversowing is a big part of that for me, because it's a two-pronged approach though, because purely from reseeding. And the other element is, by going purely reseeding, it should just take too long to get clover into the whole farm.
And another question has come in relation to, I suppose we're focusing on clover. Looking beyond that, is mixed species part of your plan? Have you looked at that, or what's your thoughts on that at this stage in terms of the future potential for that on the farm here?
Exactly, yeah. So I guess it's something that I'm educating myself on. There's a lot of trial work going on it, but it's very early days. But without a shadow of a doubt, I'm looking at mixed species and getting them in. I suppose my concern is that question of how do we get them to persist, and the longevity of the mixed species, is a big thing for me. So before I reseed again next spring, I'll definitely be learning a bit more about mixed species and how to do it.
Yeah, okay. The final question I put to you, and maybe a little bit of the take-home message comes into this one, Kevin. I suppose just reflecting on your experience to date with clover, as I said at the start, you're at the start of your journey. Is there anything you've learned so far, and particularly I want to focus on maybe your worst and best experience of an attempt maybe to oversow and get it established? And if it's to start with the worst and say, is there any particular episode which you'd say, I want to avoid ever doing that again? Or likewise on the other side, is there something which had really, really worked well and you'd always try and hit?
Okay, yeah, so I will not stand here today and say that every paddock I've tried to oversow with clover has worked. Last year was a real learning curve. I did a couple of paddocks in April. They worked really well, and then we got a bit of a drought, and I resumed doing it in July, if you like. And I did a lot of ground in July. I did 7 paddocks, and on average our paddocks are about 10 acres. So 70 acres effectively I oversow last July, Stan. And not a bit of it kept, simply because it was too late and I'd done them all together. So I'd all these, 7 paddocks coming at me, and I'd try to get them all grazed at 1100. The cows simply couldn't do it. So that was a big, big learning curve for me, and something that I definitely got wrong. So I'd say doing a small amount, doing it right, because it is unforgiving and you have to get it right.
And is there anything else on the positive side, what you'd really say really worked well and you'd always try to do it? Is that it, or is there anything else that you'd say?
On the positive side, I think if you get in early, April, May, and the watery slurry, and in particular this year, the Grand Lime, I think, gave it an extra kick. And tight grazing beforehand. I think if you follow the principles that are very clearly laid out by Teagasc, it seldom does actually go wrong, provided the soil fertility and all that is actually there. So, yeah.
Thanks, Kevin. It's great to hear such a positive story at the beginning of a journey, and I think the positivity you bring to it in terms of looking ahead, the future position on the farm, look at it's a credit to you, and continued success to you, Kevin, and all you're doing here on your farm in County Galway. That brings us to the end of our first session of this morning's Dairy Summer Tour. I want to give a special thanks to Kevin and all involved in the farm here in terms of being so open with the information and allowing us onto your farm. We're going to go live now to the second half of our Dairy Summer Tour. In a moment, you'll be joined by our second host farmer this morning, John Joe Sullivan, coming live from Roscarbery in County Cork. He'll be joined there by Lawrence Sexton, who will introduce John Joe and his farm. And as we move now to switch over to the live stream from Cork, we'll introduce John Joe's farm with a video outlining John Joe's farm, what he's doing, and his journey with clover so far. So from all here in Galway, thanks again for joining us, and we go live now to County Cork after the video. Thank you very much.
My name is John Joe Sullivan. I live here at Goran, Roscarbery, with my wife Teresa and my family. My father started farming here in 1936. He bought a farm, and in 1961 he purchased another adjoining farm. And in 2002 I bought another adjoining farm. We have a total of 111 acres at the moment. When I took over the farm back in the late 70s, I started a dairy farm. When the quota arrived, it was very hard to expand in cows. We milked the same number of cows for, I'd say, the most of 20 years at least. We were restricted to 40 cows, and we had sheep as well. We kept all the replacement calves and calved them down in 2 years and sold the extra stock. We calved around 60 cows, 60, 65. We upgraded the herd with breeding, and we were able to, there was no problem selling extra stock. We keep a few bees as well. There's a few hives. We're one of the 4 farms in the West Cork tours. People find it very interesting to be able to come out and walk the farm and see what's happening in a live working farm. So it's nice to be part of that.
You're welcome here to the Irish Grassland Association Dairy Summer here tour, sponsored by AIB, to the beautiful Rosscarbery in West Cork. I'm sitting here with John Joe Sullivan. Maybe John Joe, you have a long experience with Clover and you have a long history on this farm. Maybe you'd go through some of that history with us today.
Yeah, there's Clover on the farm, even 'twas in my dad's time. 'Tis gone back in the years, I suppose. The older people had to rely more on Clover, for there was no nitrogen available at that time, and I think they got a lot of their nitrogen from Clover. So down through the years, it's a plant we always minded, because it's a bit of a change for the cows. Rather than to be eating grass all the time, at least they have a mix in the Clover. So back in 1975, it was a dry stock farm at that time, and in 1975 we started a dairy farm. I said to my dad, did he mind if we start milking cows? So he said, it's up to you. He said, if you want to milk cows, you milk them. I said, no problem. So we had 12 suckler cows, and we started with the 12 suckler cows in 1975. So I went over to my creamery manager, and he said, anytime you bring milk here, he said, we're obliged to take it, he said. So I said, that's grand. He said, anytime at all, he said, and we got going with 12 cows. And the following year, we had 18 heifers calving down. So the following year, we had 28 cows milking, which was a big step in a small, I was nearly going too fast. And in 1979, then, we built a milking parlour, a 6-unit milking parlour, and that made life very easy for us. But then,
and John Joe, can I just say, and at that time, soon after then, you were, I suppose, nearly coming to your getting going, and the milk quotas came in, which were, I suppose, in this part of the country where there's a lot of dairying, were particularly severe as regards expansion.
That's right, yeah. We were capped in 1982 with the milk quota, and you couldn't get any more. There was no more expansion after that. And what we did was we upgraded the herd through breeding, and we concentrated on the protein on the cows, and there was British Frisian that time, and LSR and RSG. They were the two highest protein bulls you could get at the time, and we used them. And after that, then there was another bull came in, Pigeonwood Red, and there was a big jump in protein once we bred from him.
And as a consequence of that, John Joe, you not only did very well in many awards, but you won a clean milk, I think, with Carby a number of times, and also did you win the Protein 350 award?
Yeah, in 1999 we were runners up in the Protein 350 award, the All Ireland, and in 2000 we won it. So that was a big boost to the herd, because we are stuck with the same number of cows. But what we used to do, we kept all the replacement heifer, and we bred them, calved them down, and we sold the surplus stock as extra income. And at that, we were upgrading the herd all the time. So that's what brought us to the 350 Protein in 2000.
And just after that, then, a neighbouring farm next door came up for sale. You were still quota restricted, but you managed to buy that farm.
That's right, yeah. We were very lucky indeed at the same time, because land, it was the time of the change of the currency, and money, that was high in the old money, it was a lot higher in the new money. So we purchased that farm, and there was no quota, there was no entitlements with it, and the only thing we could do was we joined reps in 2004, and we concentrated more on the clover to help reduce our inputs, and we had the same number of stock over that. But at the time we used to have sheep as well. I forgot to mention that we had sheep as well for the stocking rate, and we held on to our sheep. And 2006, then we won the Quality Milk Awards for Carbery. Being suppliers of this award, we are the overall winners. And then, oh yes, sorry.
Soon after that, you joined an efficiency finding project, which is called the Dairymen Project. Maybe you'd give us a brief outline of what that entailed.
That was a European study, the Dairymen group, and I, being a member of that, I was the only man down here in West Cork, in Ireland, to be a member of it, and it was all about efficiencies. Everything that was going, all the inputs into the farm and all the outputs, they were all measured, and there was a carbon footprint built on each farm at the end of the study. So the clover was part of that as well, because the paddocks that had the clover, we are reducing nitrogen, whereas if you only saved one bag of fertilizer a year per acre, you were saving carbon, because there was carbon in the production of it, there was carbon being used for the spread of it, and for the delivery of it. So the clover was helping big time in that. That study was a very important study.
You spoke already about putting in a parlour in 1979, but I suppose one thing that stands out about this farm is your slurry storage. You have a huge amount of slurry storage. What made you make the decision to put in slurry storage and the type of mixing that's done to that slurry? Yeah. And maybe you just go through a little bit of that with us.
We built a new cow shed in 1991, and it was a slatted cow shed. All the slurry storage was underneath that shed, and it was a big saving in slurry, because we had no real facilities until then for slurry. And in 2012, we put up an extension that was due because we had extra stock in the farm as well, and we needed extra storage. So that new shed is a 10-foot tank, and there's all a tank underneath the cows, a slatted tank. So there's an aerating system in that tank, and the slurry is ready to spread. Anytime you want to spread a lot of slurry, to spread, and it is available all the time. And all our slurry then in the old tank is agitated and pumped straight across into that tank again, so that's still ready.
So you have nutrients available throughout the year whenever you want, and it's ready agitated.
That's right, yeah.
In 2015, since 2015, quotas have gone down this area, and Andrew has joined you on the farm. What differences, let's say, has Andrew helped you with? I know he's helping with the clover and getting, I suppose, the right levels of nitrogen out and stuff like that.
Yeah, no, Andrew's a very big help, because he's very efficient in the computer as well. I'd be literate in the computer. The pen and paper would be my computer, and it worked all right for me, but there's a lot of work in it. But Andrew does all the spread of the fertilizer now and the slurry, and he has it all up on app. He can pick out which paddock got which, and he have it there in front of him, which is very simple. And it makes life very easy for me, and it's great that he's along with me to take on when I won't be able to work as good. He'll be there.
And can I ask you about those other stock on the farm that need a lot of slurry storage as well? The bees. You're a beekeeper with as long as you're a dairy farmer, and maybe you tell us a small bit about that.
Yeah, I became a beekeeper through I suppose, a good friend of mine got me involved. He gave me a swarm of bees in 1979, and that year I took a break. I suppose it was in July, and I went to Garmenstone College, did a course on the preliminary cert. I got a preliminary cert on beekeeping, which is the basics of what to do with beekeeping. And since then, I never look back. I'm still very involved with them. And as well as that, you're tied to nature, because every time you go for the cows, you see what are the bees going to be working on today. You'll see the plants and all the fences. And in our farm here, most of the original fences are on the farm, which is, there's a lot of flora and our biodiversity on those fences as well. So.
And just to tell you all, if you have any questions, the mobile number is appearing on your screen there. If you have any other questions, You also, John Joe, when you're breeding cows now, and you alluded to a lot of the older bulls, what are you still looking for, or what are you looking for in the current bulls?
Yeah, the current bulls what we're looking for is a plus in protein and butterfat, which is solids, and temperament. I think very important inside Nepal. If you have white cows, cross cows, no good to you because you're meat here twice a day.
Yeah.
You know.
And what sort of levels of meal feeding and do you use every year? And how do you use your meal feeding?
Yeah, they're fed nearly all the time, but they get more when the weather is bad. If we had a wet, bad night coming up and a cold night, we'd give them an extra pull, which would help them in case you would have grass tetany or, bloat or any of them things, they'd get an extra pull in the parlour. And we're feeding about between 500 and 600 kgs a year, depending on the year.
And you're doing 500 kilos of milk solids, which is a great performance on a grassland farm.
Yeah.
So thanks. And now we'll move on to questions from Mary.
Please text them into the number which you see at the bottom of your screen. So the first question for you there, John Joe, what are your future plans for the farm?
The future plans, we have about, I suppose, 30% of our paddocks as clover, but I'd like to see them as 100% and a lot less fertilizer being spread. I think that because it benefits everywhere, So,
okay.
Anyway, yeah.
And you've been looking at clover a lot longer than other people. What initially drove you to stick with the clover, and why have you stuck with it all this time?
Yeah, I suppose it's a product that it's in the ground, only to mind it So want to reduce your nitrates, the clover will actually come itself. The seeds seem to be in the ground. That it's how they get lazy when the nitrogen has gone out. And it's a matter of mind it
And you've spoken, John Joe, about even you've spread too much nitrogen at times.
I have.
And it has affected the clover.
I have, yeah. I remember we went to Solo Head back in, I suppose, 2004. And I'll never forget it because I made a mistake myself a good few times since. You're not supposed to spread fertilizer on the clover sward, even if you're getting short of grass. And James Humphreys told us, he said, go to the other paddocks, he said, and spread the nitrogen there. So that's where I made my mistake, and that's what I'm learning. That's what I've learned from,
And it is a difficulty in where you have a lot of clover in the paddock, that to reduce your fertilizer spreader and spread less or none, and spread more on those where maybe there's less.
That's right, yeah. That's right, and that's how it's working like this. But we'll go back to the management later on, yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Any more questions, Mary? No, we're moving on. So we'll move on to the next section, and it's a video explaining about clover itself, and Mike Even will take over from me here. Thank you.
Going back in 2002 when we purchased this neighbouring farm here, we couldn't get extra quota. It was the scarcest hen's teeth in the Lissabar co-op area. You couldn't get it nowhere. And the only thing we could do was concentrate on our breeding and make our grazing more efficient. So we joined reps for 5 years because we couldn't get extra quota. And during them 5 years, I did a good bit of driving around and checking for, how to get clover going. So one day I was down in Solo Head and I thought we had clover in the farm all the time, but it was to get it managed and keep it right. 2007 or 8, I was joined at the European Dairyman Farm Study. It was all about efficiencies, so everything was being monitored for 5 years, the inputs and the outputs. And I suppose going back to that time, the clover fields, we knew exactly what was going to them, and there was a lot less fertilizer being used on them. And we'd say for the carbon footprint, every bag of fertilizer that was spared, you were saving carbon because you weren't spreading it. It had the cost to make it and the cost to deliver it. All these were taken into account. Anytime the cows go into a good clover sward, it's easily monitored now because our milk is being tested every collection, and we can see what field the cows have been in. So since that has happened, we can see there's a lift of 0.1 8% in protein, and the quantity will go up as well. So it's a very beneficial plant.
Thanks very much, Lawrence. And look, thanks, John, for having us here today. And I suppose, first of all, we've heard from Kevin that he's just started his Clover journey in the last year to 18 months. And I suppose it's gone on an awful lot longer here since the late 80s or early 90s. You touched on it a bit with Lawrence, but just what initially drove you to start using Clover more? You said it was already on the farm, but what really drove you to start focusing on it more and get more value from it?
Yeah, I think it was joining reps. Back in 2004, we concentrated on Clover, but I learned from a lot of my mistakes there because I spread Clover in a lot more paddocks than I should have, and I didn't check my soil fertility. So it was afterwards, we checked the soil fertility on the new farm, and that was very low on phosphorus and lime. So once we got those up to scratch, the Clover came on, but there had been Clover all the time in our own farm here. They were there before me, and it's still there, you know?
Yeah. And you mentioned with Lawrence too the Dairyman project and the efficiencies that you saw out of that when you joined it in the early 2000s. What were those efficiencies? And you mentioned reduction in nitrogen, but what were you spreading in fertilizer before that? And I think you can see here on the slides that your last year spread just over 150 kilos of nitrogen. What were you spreading before, and what drove you to drop it down? And what was the biggest challenge or fear you saw with dropping it down?
Yeah, I suppose the biggest challenge really was, Andy Boylan contacted me to know would I be interested in joining the Dairyman group. He said I'd be a representative from West Cork, and they didn't have any at the time. And it was a European study, so it was covering Europe. And our efficiencies were being mapped. We had a meeting then every year, and all what we had done during the year was earmarked against the next man, and we knew where fellas were making mistakes and different things. And it was all about the efficiencies of even water, sparing water, how we wasted, and all water, fertilizer, everything was measured. And with the Clover, that you could grow the grass and the Clover with a lot less fertilizer, meant that my fertilizer usage was way lower than the other farmers in the group.
Yeah.
So something had to be working, so we believed in the Clover.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I suppose you mentioned reps as well, and I suppose a lot of people probably watching this today or maybe watching later on were probably in reps as well and did include Clover in the sward as part of the reps program. But when the reps program ended, they stopped using Clover as well.
Right,
you didn't.
No, we kept it up because when we see the benefit of, I suppose when the co-op, or co-op list about when they started testing every lorry load of milk, we knew exactly where the cow had been grazed, what ground she was grazing, and the load of, we could match them with the load of milk.
Yeah.
And you knew exactly once they went into the Clover, the milk, the percentage went up by, the protein percentage went up by 0.1, and the butter fat went up, but the quantity also went up, which was, which was very responsive.
So you saw a huge, and I suppose we have seen that in recent years in Clonakilty, in Dara College, and also in the trials in Moore Park, and I suppose that's what has drove the likes of Kevin and a lot of new farmers to start looking at Clover now, and I suppose this is we need to start looking at farmers that have been doing it for a number of years to get more of a benefit from it.
Yeah.
And just in terms of the nitrogen application strategy, and I know you're going to touch on some of the management with Mark later, but your nitrogen application strategy across the year, so you're still spreading 150 kilos of nitrogen. Do you get the same on every paddock? How do you cater it? What do you do, or what's your pattern across the year?
Yeah, no, we start in the spring of the year. All ground gets about a half a bag of urea, just in order to keep the grass alive, even in the Clover paddocks. And the Clover paddocks, then once the Clover sets in, then they'll get no more fertilizer or nitrogen for the year. What they'll get is probably dirty water or very watery slurry after the grazing, which is brought at a very light rate, and it seems to be working great because we're spreading the nutrients, you see.
So you're getting a lot of that benefit in the reduction in nitrogen in the second half of the year. And you mentioned there one of the questions from Mary too, that you want to get more Clover onto your farm, and you're currently at 30%
Yeah.
of your farm. You probably have clover on an awful lot of your farm, but
That's
it's just
right.
at the level that you want. It's not on every paddock where you want it to be at the moment.
That's correct, yeah. And, you know, there could be maybe 20% in most paddocks, but I like to get that to maybe 35%, you know, clover.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then you'll get the real benefit of the nitrogen from that.
Yeah,
you know?
and the milk production as well.
And the milk production as well, yeah.
And Lawrence mentioned it in the last section too. There are a lot of stock here that are probably not included in the stocking rate, but your bees.
That's right, yeah.
So you attribute a lot of your, not only are you looking at clover for your nitrogen efficiency, your nitrogen reduction, your carbon footprint, your animal performance, but also the bee performance as well.
That's right, yeah. It's very beneficial for the bees actually, because our honey flow would be mainly the bramble, which is the briar, and the clover. And if we don't get those, we get no honey.
Yeah.
You know, if we get a bad, which we did last year, we just got a very bad spell when the briar was in full bloom. And another thing as well is that, you know, I'd like to see that, you know, spraying of fences would be banned, I'd say from the 1st of May, really, because you're killing all the flora for the bees and we'll say all the pollinators, you know?
Yeah.
So I would like to see a lot of that controlled. You know, they're talking about we'll say the flail cutting. That wouldn't be as damaging as the spray, like, you know? So they're killing a lot of biodiversity there. So I would like that would be controlled.
So you do have how many bees? You have 5 hives,
We
is
have
it?
5 hives, yeah.
5. So I hope we all get a jar of honey going home this evening.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they're working hard at the moment.
Yeah, we can see them around the farm. So just one final question before we go for Mary for questions for myself. Look, there's a lot of farmers that are looking at this today, hopefully, and look, we've heard from Kevin that has just started their journey, and you that are on your journey over 30 years looking at clover.
That's right, yeah.
What would you say to farmers and why they should now start looking at clover, or what benefit do you think they can get from it?
Yeah, I think it's going to be very beneficial down the road because nitrogen is going to get very, very scarce and be very hard got, I think, as well. So I think, you know, the clover will be there to support, you know, if they can mind it, like.
Yeah.
But not to go out and do every paddock to get, you know, it took me a while, like, to get going at it. But
yeah, and you mentioned earlier, like Kevin, your soil fertility. So I think you can see on some of the slides on the screen that your lime, your lime at 6.3 is 95% of your farm is in a 6.3 status or above.
That's right, yeah.
So, like, what do you attribute that in terms of maintaining the clover in the sward long term and how it's working?
Yeah, I think what's helping the clover is the drip feed of we'll say the dirty water and the slurry, that bit of extra phosphorus and potash, you know,
yeah, because so your P indexes and your low K indexes are probably not in where you'd want them to be on the farm as a whole, but you are constantly drip feeding P and K, whether it be 18612 or
dirty
organic,
water,
or dirty water. Sorry,
that's right, yeah, and like that is helping. That's feeding the clover all the time, you know.
And paddocks that you have put clover into didn't work before because of poor soil pH.
That's right, yeah. I set them and they just grew, but they didn't last because the pH was wrong.
Yeah.
You know.
Look, so we'll pass over to Mary now if there's any questions for John Joe.
Grant.
So John Joe, just in terms of your soil fertility, you know, what are you doing to improve your soil fertility and reach that target of, you know, your target soil pH and P and K index?
Yeah. Well, we're soil sampling, I suppose, for the last 20 years. Between every 3 and 4 years, we're soil sampling, and we're working off of them soil samples. You know, my previous Tagus advisor and the previous before him again, they used to draw up a farm plan for me. So we had, based on the soil samples, we had a fertilizer to spread. Wasn't spreading everything blanket, but we spread what fertilizer was needed to bring up what was missing in that field. And it is working very well at the moment. Mark will say more about it later on. Yeah.
And just in terms of your grassland management, are you having to do much in terms of change in grassland management to build the clover in some of your swards maybe that are suboptimal in terms of their clover percentage?
We're top.
Sorry to cut across you, John Joe and Mary. That's probably going to be dealt with in the next, not the next video, the video after that. That'll probably be dealt with in a little more detail. So I think next up we have a video on incorporating white clover into swards and how John Joe is doing it. And Mark Tracy then is going to take over from me here. So Mark has been your Teagasc advisor for the last 6 years, and you mentioned the predecessors to Mark as well. So look, we'll shoot over to the next video on incorporating clover, and then we'll hand you over to Mark Tracy, Teagasc advisor.
Grant. You have to have the soil fertility right in the ground before you put any seed in the ground, because it just won't grow. It's one thing we did when we joined reps first. We got the pH right in the ground. what we do is we soil sample every 3 to 4 years, and last time we soil sampled, all the ground was the pH was correct in it except for one paddock, and since then there's a lot of lime spread every year, and that's targeted to the one that needed most. Phosphorus and potash might be a bit low, but we're constantly topping up with slurry and 18612, pasture sward and different things to keep the clover growing. There's always clover seed, and going back in my father's time, there was clover in the seed. So it was only what was in the bag, which is about maybe kg or so like. The contractor then will take the springs off the one-pass system just to leave it on top of the ground so it isn't buried. And all that's done then is roll it. But the most important thing is not to bury the seed. You have to leave the seed in the top of the ground. We top seed now about 10 acres every year after silage. I have oversown back through the years, and because the pH wasn't right in the ground, it didn't succeed. So you'll have to have your ground right before you put out your seed, otherwise you're throwing good money after bad. Andrew spreads the overseed with the quad and the spreader. The spreader isn't open, it's just closed. There's enough space for the seed to get out when it's closed, and it seems to be working a dream. Once the seed is completed, we'll spread either dirty water or slurry with the dribble bar. That paddock will get no more nitrogen for the rest of the year other than slurry or soil water, and it gives a chance for the clover seeds to develop. You've got to lead the light down into the ground to get the seedlings established.
Right, so John Joe, I suppose a question we're getting asked an awful lot at the moment is how do farmers actually get clover onto their farms? Maybe I suppose we might deal with how you handle a full reseed to start with. What's your actual preferred method for reseeding?
Yeah, always before when we reseed a field, we'd probably have a copper rape in it first and the previous year, and we'd graze it with light stock for the winter, and then we'd just give it a one-pass system. We give it a power harrow for one run of that, and then to get about 2,000 gallons of slurry and maybe two bags of 10-20, and then we'd set the seed with the one-pass system. But we take the contractor would take the springs off the tines to leave the seed on top of the ground and to be just rolled in, and it seems to work very well, provided conditions are good.
Okay, so
yeah.
I suppose the key thing there is you're keeping the seed right on the surface to get good establishment
That's right,
of the clover plant.
Yeah, because before we used to set it just as the seeder was, but the seed was buried and it never really suffered except an odd one that stayed on top of the ground.
Very good. And in terms then of, you've mentioned a couple times already how you feel nutrition is very, very important.
Yes.
What fertilizer is actually going in the seed bed and what's going on after the crop comes up?
Yeah, about 2 bags of 10-20 we'll say to the seed bed, and then after that then it is grazed. To spray it first with graze on or with the Clover X. It is grazed with that, and then or sprayed with that, and then maybe a month later then when to be ready for grazing. Not too strong, maybe about 800 to 900 kgs per acre, and it is grazed in and grazed again maybe after about 3 weeks again, kept while it is still low, and you need to give the little clover seeds a chance to develop, so they need the light down into them,
Okay, so you're getting plenty light down into that sward, and
that's right. Yeah.
Are you following after the grazings with fertilizer? Dirty water seems to be a big feature of the farm here.
Yeah, a lot of all the soil water is harvested here and going back over the years for a long time, and we get great beneficial out of the soil water because you've all the nutrients that's in the yard is in it, and it do help, and you're not killing anything with nitrogen, so it's helping the seedlings as well, like, and it's keeping the phosphorus and the potash and the phosphorus in the ground, like it to feed it.
Very good. I suppose moving on then to oversowing, like Kevin kind of alluded to it in his piece earlier, that you can't just go and do full reseeds on a full farm to just put in clover. It doesn't make sense. So overseeding is probably something that more and more farmers are going to try.
Yeah, I totally agree with sorry.
Yeah, I suppose just in terms of what is your method, we saw the Einbach or similar machine being used in Kevin's farm. What method are you using?
Yeah, we use the spreader with the quad, and when we cut the silage, when the ground is bare, Andrew goes out with the quad spreader, and before when we had the spreader new, we had to open it to notch 2, and it was fine, but with the wear now and things like, once it's closed, leave it out at the perfect flow, and he'll cover the ground with that in, and then we'll give it soil water straight away again. And as soon as the grass starts coming up, we'll say maybe it'll be about 800-900, and we'll graze it in, and we'll get another coat of dirty water, and to graze it again. We keep it grazed tight for the rest of the year. And that helps.
And I suppose it's been mentioned that you do have a level of clover in nearly every paddock on the farm.
That's right, yeah.
So what kind of triggers your mind that we need to go and top it up and we need to go over sowing?
Yeah, I'd like to have more clover in the swards. So the top seeding seems to work very good in them cases. Like, so you'll get the clover where it isn't, you know.
And kind of how little clover before you'd be saying it needs to be topped up?
Oh yeah, you'll be back down to about 15%, I'd say, you know, clover.
And then to go over sowing, what sort of rate of seed would you use?
We use 2.5 kgs to the acre of unpelleted seed. We seem you get more seeds than that, I think, and it seems to work as good as the pelleted seed, you know, provided the conditions are good, you know, and you have your lime and pH is good in the ground as well. It's very important to have them right.
Very good.
You know, to get a take.
We might just hand back to Mary there for any questions.
Questions coming in there on bloat. John Joe, have you had any issues with bloat across the years?
Yeah, no, never had an issue with bloat, even down through the years. Even my dad either before, so we never had a problem with bloat. But I think what's helping us is that the cows get a 12-hour allocation of grass with the fencer, so they have to graze down the lush clover. They have to follow that down. Whereas if they were left into a full paddock, I'd say we'd have fierce problems because they'd run around and they'd eat the heads off it all, and then the cow should be blown out. Like you'll be in real trouble. But I think it's management of the sward. I think is our key.
So you're on a 12-hour allocation right across the year?
That's right, yeah.
Okay.
Right across, yeah.
And just in terms of cow type, have you looked at crossbreeding, or just if you could mention the cow type you have here, just there's a quick question on that there as well.
Oh yeah, our cow type I'd say would be I'd say a cross between a Holstein and British Friesian. Not she can be middle of the road. No, all pure Friesian. All pure Friesian. I did dabble a bit in Norwegian Red, but I thought the Friesian there's as good a breeding in the Friesians, and they're a more temperament cow, you know. So we stay with the Friesian.
Very good.
Yeah.
So you can keep the questions coming in there, and we'll move on now just onto a video talking about how John Joe manages to keep the clover in the swards.
The most important thing is not to damage it at any stage. So what we do is we get our silage cut early, make sure it's cut young. The ground is always rolled before the silage ground is stopped, so that they can cut it clean. You have no messy on top of the ground, and the clover is ready to take off as soon as the silage is cut. Most important is not to damage the ground anyway, no poaching, not to leave covers go too heavy. Any cover that will get heavy will be cut. There's only one first cut taken, and that's about 40 acres every year. All the rest of the silage is picked up then as surplus grass. Silage ground is only cut once. The grazing ground will be cut in for to pick up bales, and that helps to keep the clover alive in all the paddocks. We normally graze around the 1300, and after that, if it gets too strong, it's held for another week and it's cut for bales. The most important thing is when you are grazing in the spring and wet weather is to leave the cows graze, bring them back in, because there's no poaching then. And if they didn't graze properly, there'll be a couple of days down the road when you can let them back and they'll graze the whole thing right. You won't expect to graze out clover too severe, you'll damage it and it's gone.
So I suppose, John Joe, it's one thing to get clover established. It's another big task to actually keep it in the sward. And I suppose from traveling around to farms, it's one of the things that farmers are always asking, what can they do to actually keep clover in the swards? This farm has clover in the swards for years, and you seem to be able to maintain it. So maybe what would you think are the key management techniques that you need to keep the clover?
Yeah, I think the first one is not grazing too heavy covers, and as well as that, if you're cutting silage, not to cut it too strong. If the problem is, it happened to me down through the years as well. Like I had a lovely field of clover. There was 8 acres in it, and the weather broke, and I couldn't cut the silage, and the grass lodged, and it finished the silage. So it's very important, if you can, get your silage off before any lodging or anything. And as well as that, in the spring of the year, you need to keep your grass growing as well, because some fellas have a big problem with clover. They say the clover takes over altogether, and the grass dies out, and they end up then with patches in the field. So I think what happens there is the clover overtakes the grass, and in the spring of the year, when the clover isn't growing, what we do, we go out with half a bag of urea, and you'll prop up the grass, keep the grass alive, and when the clover will kick in, that'll sort out the nitrogen for the grass and everything then.
So there's about 140 kilograms of nitrogen spread per hectare on this farm.
That's right.
But you're very much front-loading that to the springtime of the year. So
that's right, yeah.
You mentioned you don't like grazing too heavy. In your head, what is heavy cover?
Anything over 14 is too heavy. What we do, we'd hold it for an extra week and take bales off it then. So we graze between 12 and 13 would be nearly max. You know?
And do you have any issues preserving silage with clover in it?
No problem. It's not whatsoever. No, because we don't have the high nitrogen in it. You know. So.
And I suppose you have the luxury in this farm of that the whole farm is the milking platform as such.
That's right. Yeah.
So are you rotating your silage ground around the farm? Is first cut from a different area each year, or how are you dealing with that?
Yeah, our first cut is probably from the same area every year, but which is the largest fields, is easiest to cut, and they cut the most of it. But in saying that, there's only one cut per year. We've paddocks out now out in the farm, and there's one of many in particular. It's 30 years this year since it was reseeded, and it's been topped up with clover two times since. No spraying, and everything is working perfect, and the seeds are alive, and the clover is brilliant in it. So, you know.
Very good. And in terms of taking paddocks, then you seem to think that is important for the clover, like that while cutting a heavy sward can maybe do a bit of damage, light cuts seem to be quite beneficial.
Yeah, because you're cutting the whole thing clean, and you'll leave a very clean butt, so that the little plants have great light, and that they'll take off as soon as the silage is cut.
Maybe something I probably should have asked you in the last section, but when is the ideal time in your mind for actually going over sowing and getting the clover into the system?
Yeah, I think the best time to set it is as early as possible in the year. If you can go out and, if you had a field that would be grazed very well with the cows in April, it's a great time to get out, because you have the seed out early, and you'll have a great chance to go in. But we always put it out after the first cut silage. That's when we'd spread ours. You know.
Very good.
Yeah.
So, Mary, is there any questions?
Yeah, so just a question there on weed control, in terms of your weed control in your new reseed and also in your established grassland. Have you any problems with weeds and those, and what are you doing to control them?
No, the only thing we will in the new reseeds, what we do, we burn off the field first, and we take a cut of silage, and then when the grass just starts to green, then we'll burn it off, so that you won't be killing any bees or any type of pollinators. There'll be no flora in the grass. And we then to get clover eggs to protect the young clover seeds, and that seems to do a great kill. And then for the mature grass, there's never spray. We don't ever spray mature grass for dog roots or for any. We have a good bit of dandelion in the farm, but I think it's a very good plant, because it's deep rooted, it has high nutrients, and the cows love it. So if there's anything growing after the cows grazing, we come in with the topper. Our topper would be our weed control, you know? So I think that works for us.
Very good. And just
Yeah.
a final question there. Have you ever considered multi-species or red clover on the farm here?
We haven't, no, we've never set him, even though we have a paddock ready, no, and Andrew is very anxious to get him in. So I think that's what we'll be putting in this time. So we'll have a bash at that and we'll see how we get on with it.
Very good. That's all the questions from me. So it is. Thanks very much, John Joe.
Right, thanks, Mary. Yeah.
Okay, so folks, as head of the Dairy Summer Tour Committee, it's my job to wind up proceedings for today. I suppose you'll be quite aware that Clover is an important part of the sustainability strategy for Irish dairy farming. And what we hope you'll have got from today is that it is achievable and it is quite doable, but it's not going to be without its challenges. So a bit like John just said, it's up to people to get out there and educate themselves in relation to the demands that are going to be on them in terms of delivering clover on their farms and helping to reduce their nitrogen into the future. So it's good from a nitrogen point of view. It's obviously good from a carbon point of view in terms of reducing the fertilizer. And as John Joe has alluded to, it's also good from a biodiversity point of view from the bees, from his perspective here on his farm in Rosscarbery. So look, as I said, as the head of the Summer Tour Committee for this year, I want to just acknowledge the support of AIB in delivering the proceedings to you today. I also want to thank very much the Summer Tour Committee that are involved with me, without whom this wouldn't have been possible. And I would also like to acknowledge the guys behind the cameras and Star Systems who've been excellent to work with. And finally, I would like to obviously extend a huge thanks to both Joe Sullivans and the Morans in Galway for having us on their farms today and telling us their story. And finally, in what is Farm Safety Week, I wish you all very well in your farming for the rest of 2021 and wish you happy and safe farming. And thank you very much for tuning in today. I hope you enjoyed it.